Hello, who's out there? It's Friday night, round 7 of Bourbon and Scary Stories with yours truly. Check in and we'll get started. So this is David Domine. Hey, Donnie. Glenda, good to see you. Hey, Mitzi. Suzanne, good you're checking in. Hi, Eileen. Timothy, Greer, hi. Sheila, hi. So grab your bourbon or whatever you're drinking, settle in, and let's get ready for some stories. Hey, Laura. Hey, Catherine. Hey, Lisa. So can you believe it's the 7th night already? More than a week. Hey, Beth. So what's everyone drinking tonight? When you're checking in, make sure you say hi. Tell people where you're from, what city and state. If you're from out of the country, let us know. Hey, Justin, Donetta, Charles, good to see you back. Hey, Kim. And especially if you're from out of country, if you're from Asia, Europe, Mexico, say hi. And let people know what you're drinking. I have a new bourbon tonight, JTS Brown. And comes in a bottle like this. I don't think I've had it before. I've heard about it, and I knew all about it because JTS Brown used to live in old Louisville, right around the corner from the Widmer house, which I told you about the other night. And if any of you have been on Ormsby Avenue, like across from Buck's Restaurant, can you see that? It's a little bright. Let me see how I can do that. That's the JTS Brown house. Beautiful orange brick Beaux-Arts mansion built in the late 1800s. Still there today. Thomas Evers, VG Evers, they know about this place. So that's the JTS Brown house. And that's the bourbon I'm drinking tonight. Okay, so if you're checking in, like I said, let people know where you're from. Say hi, what city, what state you're calling in from or viewing from. If you're from out of country, let us know. We love out of country visitors. And if you've been here all 7 nights, make sure you let people know you're a charter member, okay? Hey, Kayla. Hey, Nancy. Javier. So, trying to think if there's anything I need to tell before we get started. If you got friends out there, invite them to join us. The more, the merrier. Every night we're getting more viewers and more views in the end, which is really great. If you don't know, you can always watch this after the fact. This will be on my Facebook page, so it's nice to tune in live, but if you miss it, you can just watch it the day after or 2 days after. So they'll all be on my Facebook page. Eventually, these will be on the Louisville Historic Tours YouTube channel, which we have, thanks to my friend Sean Stafford and Huntley Media. They've been doing a great job promoting us. Once things are over and we're out and about again, hope you can come and take some of our tours and see these places we're talking about up close and personal. So if you're just coming in for the first night, my name's David Domine, and I lived in old Louisville, Kentucky for many, many years. And I started writing books about the neighborhood. Started off telling ghostly stories about the neighborhood. So the stories we've been visiting for the last several nights and tonight come from my 11th book. It's called True Ghost Stories and Eerie Legends from America's Most Haunted Neighborhood. It's a compilation of my 3 previous ghost books. They're in what's called the Ghost of Old Louisville series, Ghost of Old Louisville, Phantoms of Old Louisville, and Haunts of Old Louisville. But most of the stories in these 3 books have been edited and updated and put in this one book. So if you're looking for a book that's the go-to on the hauntings in Old Louisville, this is it. All right. So the plan is to help us get through quarantine. Every night at 9 o'clock, I'm going to be here telling stories from these books. Because normally, March 15th to November 15th, I'd be out on the streets of Old Louisville, taking groups around and telling these stories myself and visiting these places. But since we're all kind of homebound, I just figured I'll get online and share a couple stories every night and give people a tour virtually. And hopefully when things calm down, we can get out and come down and meet me in person if you haven't already, and take a tour for yourself and see some of these places we're learning about. The good thing is we do these virtual tours, these virtual storytelling hours. We can cover a lot more of the neighborhood that we can on our normal tours. Every night the tour takes about 90 minutes. We can only hit like 6 or 7 of the main spots, but telling stories, we can jump all over. You know, Old Louisville is a very big neighborhood, 45 square blocks of old houses. It's one of the largest historic preservation districts in the country. So this is my way of helping you all get through this quarantine situation, and you're all helping me getting through it by coming in and checking in every night. So once again, if you're just checking in, say hi to people, say where you're from, what you're drinking tonight. Once again, I'm doing JTS Brown Bourbon. I got a new one tonight, but I'm still in my snifter, so I'm kind of doing fancy stuff. So if you're all ready, we'll get started. And once again, the plan is once I run out of stories from this book, which will probably be in 3 or 4 nights, then I'll just start reading stories from my memoir about the house I lived in. And if you checked in several nights ago, I told you all the story about the Widmer house, aka La Casa Fabulosa. It's where I lived for 8 years, bought it in 1999. I was there till 2008, but right before I moved in, the previous owner told me there was a ghost that came with the house. And I had some strange things happen in this house, and that's the house on the corner, or I'm sorry, on the cover here. But the most interesting part of living in a haunted house I discovered was the real life characters, the interesting neighborhood people. So there's a lot of laughs in this book and a lot of scary things. So if you heard the story about Widmer House the other night, this takes that one story that's a chapter in one of my other books and expands it into a whole book. It kind of covers a year in the house. So if you've heard the story of the witch's tree, the ice boy, Annie Whipple, a lot of the stories I've been talking about are mentioned in this book and how I kind of discovered them, the gypsies in Old Louisville and things like that. So, all right. I see a lot of people checking in, so good to see you. Hey, Holly Rudolph and Helena Marty, good to see you. So if you're just checking in, tell people where you're from, what you're drinking tonight, and start conversations as we're doing this, and maybe tell people how you know me if you know me in person, or how long you've known me if you're one of my old Louisville friends, like Beth. Beth is one of my oldest friends here in Louisville. I moved here in 1993. I was only going to stay for a year, but I ended up never leaving, so it's my hometown now. Okay, so we're ready to start with the first story. You all ready? Okay. All right. Well, our first story tonight, and we have 2 of them, and this involves a church, like our second story. Okay, so the church is on South 3rd Street, and it's just a couple blocks north of where I used to live on South 3rd Street. It's the Walnut Street Baptist Church. And if you're in Old Louisville, everyone knows this church because we've got over a dozen beautiful churches, but this is one of the grandest ones. And here's a picture from the book of what this church looks like. You see that? So it's a beautiful limestone Gothic church. It was built in 1902. And originally, the church before that stood at the corner of 4th and Muhammad Ali in downtown Louisville. They say it was founded in 1802 by Squire Boone. He was the brother of Daniel Boone, and it was considered one of the most influential congregations in the South. But after the church moved to its current location at the corner of 3rd Street and St. Catherine in Old Louisville, weird things started to happen. And supposedly a curse was put upon the church, and that survives today in the form of something known as the Demon Leaper. And that's the title of chapter 6 in this book that I'm getting the story from. And the Demon Leaper is kind of a Mothman-like creature who they say haunts the spires of this beautiful church. And he's described kind of as a gargoyle come to life, where he's half bat, he's half human. But back in the 60s, people were talking about who they call the Demon Leaper. And if you know anything about English folk tales and legends and lore. We all know who Jack the Ripper was, but before there was Jack the Ripper, there was this strange creature in London called Spring-Heeled Jack. And they don't know if it was a real, creature or if it was a man dressing up. Well, we had something similar to that in the United States, and he appeared in several different forms. And in Louisville, he became known as the Demon Leaper because he was known to be able to bound great distances. And the people who saw the Demon Leaper always described him the same way. He looked to be bigger than a normal human being. He had strong, muscular legs, and he had kind of leathery, bat-like wings. So a lot of people said he was like an early version of Batman, but like literally half bat and half man. In the 60s, along that stretch of St. Catherine, where the church is today, and if any of you are locals and you know Dizzy Whiz, that stretch, there used to be a lot of houses still in that part of the neighborhood, and they tore them down in the 60s and 70s. But in the 60s, a family was living in one of these row houses along St. Catherine Street, and they said they would always see this strange thing up in the highest spire of the Walnut Street Baptist Church. And they said it looked like a huge bird just jumping back and forth between the spires. And whenever they told people, people would say, oh, it's just probably an eagle or a hawk or something. But they said, no, it's much, much bigger than this. And one of the children in the family claimed to have actually seen this creature kind of swoop down low. And he said it had like a human face, but like a bird or a bat body. And so there's several accounts that go back to the 60s and 50s when people first reported sightings of this creature at the Walnut Street Baptist Church that became known as the Demon Leaper. But in the 80s, then more people started reporting sightings of this. And one of them was someone who was renting an apartment nearby on St. Catherine. And this guy, he said he was with his girlfriend in his bedroom one night, and she went off to take a shower, and he was kind of making the bed, and he heard something. He had like a side balcony that jutted out from his bedroom. The houses in Old Louisville tend to be kind of really close together, but there was like a little side balcony, and he heard something kind of disturb the air outside the balcony. And so he went out to see what it was, and he said he saw this huge, massive bird-like creature kind of launching itself up in the air and fly up into the spire of the church. And he couldn't believe his eyes at first, but he said when he went to the railing of the balcony, he looked down and there were scratch marks in, the concrete railing. And he said the concrete railing was kind of mossy, but this thing had left like scratch marks as it took off up into the air. And he said he put his hand over these scratch marks, and he said the paw or the claw print of this creature were bigger than a human hand. And so many people in Louisville have reported sightings of this creature they call the Demon Leaper. Well, like I said before, what happens when I do my stories, when I write my stories, is people tell me these things. There's a lot of folklore. There's a lot of oral traditions in the neighborhood. A lot of these are legends, and legends are inherently not true, but often something gives rise to a legend. So I always try to snoop around and see what I can find that might have planted the beginnings of this legend. Or very often, it's a story where I come up with something that kind of corroborates what people in the modern day are saying. And so I did some research, and I found a lot of interesting history about this church. And so in 1902, the Walnut Street Baptist Church was in the national news because the New York Times had written a story about them. And I have a copy of it in the book, but you can see the title right here is "To Boycott Louisville Church." And what happened was in Old Louisville, a lot of the locals weren't happy when the Walnut Street Baptist Church decided to move from its downtown location to the current location, which is at the corner of St. Catherine and 3rd Street, because this church was going to break all the rules that the neighborhood planners had set out. And if you lived on Millionaires Row, the old 3rd Street back in the day, people signed deeds that had covenants that said they would build their doors at least 30 feet back from the sidewalk, because the idea was they wanted to promote 3rd Street as a promenade street. They wanted to have nice broad sidewalks and big wide front yards, so it had like an open view all the way down the blocks and blocks of Millionaires Row. Well, the Walnut Street Baptist Church didn't decide to do this. They decided they were going to build their church with their front doors opening right up onto 3rd Street. And of course, when the plans were revealed and they started to build, the neighbors had a fit, because just like today, imagine what it was like back then. The same thing was true. People were worried about what, the neighbors were doing and how it was going to affect their property values. So they tried to persuade the church to move the building back, but the pastor of the church, Dr. Eaton, he didn't care what the neighbors thought, and it came to such a furor, and there's so many protests in the neighborhood that the New York Times came and they sent reporters to cover this story. And one of the reporters was interviewing Dr. Eaton and saying, well, this isn't a very Christian, action that you're taking. You're really going to affect your neighbors and their property values. And Dr. Eaton, as it turns out, thought that this was an off-the-record kind of report. And he said, well, we don't care because we hope that that's what happens, that their properties devalue and they all move away and we're able to buy up their land cheap. And it turns out they had a plan. And the reporter actually wrote this article, and he kind of exposed Dr. Eaton. And a lot of the neighborhood residents who went to the Walnut Street Baptist Church, they withdrew and they started to go to other churches. And to this day, it's kind of interesting that a lot of the neighbors in old Louisville don't go to the Walnut Street Baptist Church. Most of the people that go to Walnut Street Baptist Church come from, the suburbs. They come into town. And in any case, there's a lot of bad blood in the neighborhood. And supposedly, I don't know who it was, but supposedly someone in the neighborhood put a curse on the church. And it manifested itself in the form of this winged creature. He was kind of an omen. He was a sign of bad luck and kind of ill feelings that had been generated in the neighborhood. And it was a direct result of what happened with the church carrying through its plans and building the big massive structure on the site where it is today. Incidentally, the man who led the protest and alerted the New York Times, it was a guy named Mr. Gathright, and he lived right next door to the plot where the Walnut Street Baptist Church had their construction site. And the funny thing is, once things kind of carried out and their plans came to fruition, the very first piece of land that the church bought up and took away was that of Mr. Gathwright's house. And Mr. Gathwright's old house is still there on the land today, but what the church did is they built a new facade across the front, and that is like the community center or the social welfare center. I don't know what's called today. But Mr. Gathwright's house is still there, but it was acquired by the church, and the church incorporated it into their plans, and it's kind of part of their grounds. I know a lot of people like Deborah Richards, who's a local preservationist, and unfortunately, she says churches are always some of the worst guardians when it comes to historic structures. A lot of times, church members, they don't live in the neighborhood where they're going to church, so they don't have a vested interest in maintaining the property and things like that. So it seems like that's the case here with the Walnut Street Baptist Church. Even though I know people at the Walnut Street Baptist Church, they're great people, but today a little bit of bad blood lives on, and they say it's in the form of the Demon Leaper. Now, the interesting thing about the Demon Leaper is when I did research and I found out about what happened with the Walnut Street Baptist Church and the curse that was supposedly laid upon it, it turns out that winged creatures like human-like gargoyles weren't all uncommon back then. And for several years before, for several decades, there was a whole rash of sightings of like gargoyle-like human bat-like creatures across the United States and especially in Kentucky. So one of the most interesting stories I found was one that was in the New York Times, and it was about something that was seen flying over the city. And the article was called An Aerial Mystery. And the article came out, this would have been, a decade or two before the Walnut Street Baptist Church was built, came out in 1880. But the funny thing is, it kind of lays the groundwork for there being a tradition of winged, strange kind of half-human creatures in the area. And so what this reporter wrote in this article, An Aerial Mystery, it's quite a long article, so I'll just read a couple highlights, but it said, "One day last week, a marvelous apparition was seen near Coney Island. At the height of at least 1,000 feet in the air, a strange object was seen in the act of flying toward the New Jersey coast. It was apparently a man with bat's wings and improved frog's legs. The face of the man could be distinctly seen, and it wore a cruel and determined expression. The movements made by the object closely resembled those of a frog in the act of swimming, with its hind legs and wings flying with front legs moving. Of course, no respectable frog has ever been known to conduct himself in precisely that way, but were a frog to wear bat's wings and to attempt to swim and fly at the same time, he would correctly imitate the conduct of the Coney Island monster, as it became known. When we add that the monster waved his wings in answer to the whistle of a locomotive and was of a deep black color, the alarming nature of the apparition can be imagined. The object was seen by many reputable persons, and they all agreed that it was a man engaged in flying towards New Jersey." And so then they go on, the reporter goes on to describe and speculate what this thing could be, and they think maybe it was a local pastor who had come up with this magical suit that would help him fly because he needed to go west to go to the territories where there were a lot of sin, and he was going to do his preaching there. But the funniest part of this article was where they mention our area. So he says, "Beyond any question, either the flying man or some scientific person at present unknown has invented the bat's wings and frog's legs with which the flying man now sails through the air, which has not the inventor patented his invention and has himself duly written up by the press? The reason is obvious. The flying man is engaged in some undertaking which he cannot safely proclaim. In other words, he is an aerial criminal, a fact which explains the cruelty and determination visible on his countenance. And what can be the nefarious object which this probable wretch has in its view? It cannot simply be theft and robbery, for it would manifestly be impossible for him in his flying costume to perpetrate burglary or highway robbery, or to pick pockets. It cannot be plumbing, for obvious reasons, neither can it be the sale of books published by subscription only, yet the flying villain must have an object, and we have a right to assume that only a peculiar nefarious object could induce a man to fly to New Jersey or St. Louis in hot weather and without umbrella or mosquito net." And then the best part is then next when they surmise who it must be. "It has not escaped notice that of late Mr. Talmage has been wandering in the West in search of entertaining varieties of crime herewith to establish his sermons. It is also known that he returned to this city just before the flying man of Coney Island was seen. Now, if there is a man in this country whose arms and legs are fitted to endure the muscular strain inseparable from the act of flying, that man is Mr. Talmage. He has preached for years, and those graceful limbs have accompanied him and must have developed and hardened their muscles to an extent which would fill every other professional acrobat with envy. And what is more probable than that Mr. Talmage has equipped himself with wings in order to study interesting types of immorality from the lofty heights of 1,000 feet. He has flown over St. Louis and Kentucky, precisely the places which might be expected to yield a rich reward to an investigator of crime, and he is now flying to and fro over Coney Island. So back then, Kentucky had kind of a reputation for being a sin-ridden, a vice-ridden, a violent and bloody place. And supposedly, the New York Times thought this strange creature was flying to Kentucky because it was a religious man headed that way to kind of help the people of Kentucky. But what is really strange is the Coney Island wrote these articles, or I'm sorry, the New York Times and the Coney Island paper wrote these articles, but guess what happened not too long, just a couple months distance from that? All of a sudden, Louisville papers started reporting sightings of strange flying creatures and flying machines over downtown Louisville. And so one of them, and it was in the same year, 1880, it was August 6th, the Courier-Journal, and I have these articles, these are verbatim quotes from the articles. The Courier-Journal ran an article called "The Flying Machine," and it kind of corroborates what the New York Times was writing about. And the article was entitled, after the flying machine, "What Two Louisvillians Saw Last Evening." And this is like one paragraph from the article. It says, between 6 and 7 o'clock last evening, Mr. C.A. Youngman and Ben Flexner were standing at a side window of Haddart's drugstore at 2nd and Chestnut Streets, looking skyward when they discovered an object high up in the air, apparently immediately above the Ohio River Bridge, which they at first thought was the wreck of a toy balloon. As it got nearer, they observed that it had the appearance of a man surrounded by machinery, which he seemed to be working with his feet and hands. He worked his feet as though he was running a treadle, and his arms seemed to be swinging to and fro above his head, though the latter movement sometimes appeared to be executed with wings and fans. And then they go on to describe this strange flying thing over the Ohio River in Louisville, Kentucky in 1880. And then they bring in other witnesses who say they saw this. And who knows? Back then, reporting was a little different. You didn't have the ability to check witnesses. Reporters sometimes made things up. But the funny thing is, a lot of this corroborates what was going on in other parts of the country. And then in other parts of Kentucky, they started reporting similar things. And what was it? It was, let me read the little description. But then they started seeing sightings of this demon-like, this bat-like creature, like London Spring-Heeled Jack, bounding through the streets of downtown Louisville. And this was on July 28th, 1880. A local newspaper wrote, "A tall and thin weirdo, agile as a monkey and with a long nose, pointed ears, and long fingers, appeared in this vicinity, Louisville, around July 28th, 1880. He wore a sort of uniform made of fabric and with a long cape and metallic helmet. On his chest under the cape was a large bright light. His big things seemed to be scaring people, particularly women, sometimes getting so familiar as to pull their clothing off. His favorite method of escape was by springing smoothly over large objects, like haystacks or wagons, then vanishing on the other side." So there's a number of articles like this, but they all they seem to corroborate a rash of sightings that was happening in the United States in the late 1800s, and they saw them in other parts of the country. In Texas, up until the 1960s, they were reporting something similar. So they think Spring-Heeled Jack kind of, once he died out in London, he moved across the Atlantic and started appearing in the United States. And some of our most famous sightings are here in Louisville. And they think that the creature they're seeing in the spires of the Walnut Street Baptist Church is a manifestation of this creature we have now in Louisville. And as far as I know, Louisville is the only place that calls it the Demon Leaper. You know, other places they call it Spring-Heeled Jack or Spring-Heeled Jack. In Ohio and West Virginia, they have the Mothman. There are indigenous cultures in the United States that have seen kind of flying bird or bat-like creatures. They have different names for them. But if you come to Louisville, they call him the Demon Leaper. And the site that he has supposedly haunted for many, many years is the Walnut Street Baptist Church at the corner of 3rd and St. Catherine. Okay, so that is probably one of the weirdest stories I uncovered in the neighborhood. And not only weird because of this creature that, you know, defies categorization, but because there is a lot of historical record with accounts of strange half-human creatures and flying machines over the Ohio River. And you can go and look in the newspapers from the 1880s and you see these stories. These are not made up. I've got them listed in my book, and you can actually go and pull up these articles and read what people were seeing and reporting and what they were writing about back then. Okay? So that is one church on 3rd Street in Old Louisville. And there's another church not too far away, just a couple blocks to the south, and it's the beautiful First Church of Christ Scientist. And like I mentioned last night, most people consider this one of, if not the most famous haunts in the neighborhood. And they definitely say it's the most tragic, the most upsetting story in the neighborhood as well, because it involves a couple that was in love. So, if any of you have been to Old Louisville, you know, at the corner of 3rd and Ormsby, kind of across from where the Filson Historical Society is, there is a huge church. It's the First Church of Christ Scientist, and it was started in 1916. And the striking feature about this church is this wonderful entryway. It's kind of a Grecian portico. There's 13 columns. They're huge columns that like rise 3 stories up. Each one of them is carved from a single block of stone. They were barged in from Bowling Green, one piece at a time, and installed, so it kind of makes the architecture stand out. But the other reason is in the neighborhood, this stands out because it's haunted by someone they call the Lady of the Stairs. And the Lady of the Stairs is a female apparition, not surprising, the Lady of the Stairs. And she's said to haunt the front steps of the church. And there's a beautiful set of stairs, and the steps, they go all the way across the front. And let me see if I can find a picture of this. And if you saw the invitation for the event tonight, that building I had was a picture of the Lady of the Stairs haunt. And here we got a picture right here. That's the front step. So the Lady of the Stairs is known to haunt this area where the stairs are going up. And she's always described the same way. The Lady of the Stairs is, like I said, a female apparition. She might be 18, 19 years of age. She's lovely. She has jet black hair, done up in a Gibson girl kind of hairdo. And she's a sad, forlorn kind of ghost. Often people say you hear her sobs echoing down 3rd Street as they pass by. Always, this beautiful apparition is wearing a long, flowing white gown, because if you're a female apparition, what do you need to wear? A long, flowing white gown, right? So she's kind of your stereotypical ghost. But as far as we can tell, this ghost, known as the Lady of the Stairs, is actually someone who lived in the neighborhood back in the day. And they called her Miss G. The G stood for Gathright, and actually this Gathright was related to the Gathright who owned the church next to the owned the house next to the Walnut Street Baptist Church. But they were one of the prominent neighborhood families, and Miss G's part of the family came from Bardstown, so a half hour south of Louisville. It's the Bourbon capital. And the story is, in 1918, Miss G graduated from high school, and her parents were having some financial issues, so they were hoping to marry their daughter off into one of the wealthy distilling families. The only problem was there were no young men available for marriage in town. There was only one man looking for a bride, and it was an elderly distiller, many, many years older than Miss G. Well, of course, he liked this idea. Miss G's parents were fine with it, but Miss G, she wasn't so keen on this idea of marrying this older man. And it wasn't just because he was older. The reason she didn't want to marry him is because she was in love with someone already. And so this was 1918. What was going on in the world back then? It was World War I. So there were no young men in town because they all had signed up and they joined the army and they were all off fighting in the war in Europe. And one of them was a young officer who had earned some leave. He came back to Bardstown. That's when he met Miss G and they fell in love and they hoped to get married. But he was called back up to duty and he had to return to Belgium. So he promised Miss G that when the war ended and he was discharged, that's when he would come back and get her. But the parents didn't like this idea. And so when they found this out, they sent their daughter away so she wouldn't be in Bardstown when he returned. And where did they send her? Well, they sent her to Louisville to live with an aunt and uncle. And the aunt and uncle would kind of be their chaperones and prevent the two from seeing each other again. And these chaperones, the aunt and uncle, lived in Old Louisville on 3rd Street, just a block down from where the modern day First Church of Christ Scientist stands. What the parents didn't know, though, is that when the war ended in November of 1918 and the young soldier was discharged, he found out if he re-enlisted in the army right away, he could have his choice of postings across the country. And that included the largest military base in the nation back then, which was Camp Zachary Taylor. And if you're Louisville locals, you probably know where Camp Zachary Taylor was, right? Yeah, Camp Zachary Taylor was in Louisville, just a couple miles away from where the First Church of Christ Scientist stood. And actually, where I live today in the Highlands, I can walk out and go that way, and in 10 minutes, I'm on the grounds of where Camp Zachary Taylor stood, the largest military base in the nation. So the young soldier took this posting at Camp Zachary Taylor, knowing that that would bring him closer to his beloved. And it proved actually very easy for them to meet because Miss G's aunt and uncle weren't very strict chaperones. Every night after dinner around 8 o'clock, she'd leave their front door and she'd say, "I'll see you later, Aunt and Uncle. I'm going down to Amorti's to see my girlfriends." And Amorti's was a famous ice cream parlor at the corner of 3rd and Ormsby. And it's right next to the First Church of Christ Scientist. It was just kind of kitty corner across the street from my house on 3rd Street, the Widmer house. And it was where all the young people hung out. They had a soda fountain, and it was all the rage to go to Amorti's back in the day. Unfortunately, they tore it down in the 1970s. By the way, my old house, the Widmer house, Doug, the guy who kind of restored it, I mean, didn't have a lot of work to do, but he, as they were tearing down Amorti's, he went and got their staircase and he transplanted it into our house because our servant staircase had been taken out. So the people who live in our house, they can say their servant staircase is the old Amorti's staircase. Well, in any case, that's what Miss G told her aunt and uncle. She was going to Amorti's to see her friends. And to her credit, Miss G wasn't lying. She was going to see her girlfriends, but she'd only see them for a few minutes, and then she would excuse herself and she would go back to the steps of the church. Because back in the day, these steps, the steps of the First Church of Christ Scientist, were like the rendezvous spot for all the young sweethearts in the neighborhood. And any given night, if you went to the corner of 3rd and Ormsby to the First Church of Christ Scientist, these steps right here, there'd be dozens of couples hanging out. And that was the place you'd meet for your dates. And then you go downtown, you go to the movies, or you go to Amorti's, or you'd walk through the neighborhood. And so Miss G and her boyfriend would meet there almost every night like clockwork at a little after 8 o'clock. And it went on like this for a month and then another month. But eventually, Miss G and her boyfriend grew tired of sneaking around. They were meeting at the church one night, their typical time, when they decided, it was just time for them to run away and elope. And so they decided the next night, Friday night, they'd carry out the plan they had been hatching for several weeks. And the plan was they would meet on the steps of the Walnut Street Baptist Church like they normally did, but then they'd go downtown to Union Station. They'd get the overnight train that went to Chicago, and the young soldier had relatives in Chicago. He said he could stay with them and hide out, and they would get married there, and then they would break the news to Miss G's parents, and they would just have to deal with this. So Miss G was all excited. The next night, Friday night, rolled around, and it was time for them to elope. But when Miss G showed up at the ice cream parlor, there was no sign of him nearby. She hadn't seen him on the stairs, and so she went to look for him in the ice cream parlor. Well, her friends were there. They saw her, and right away, her friends knew something was up because Miss G had a suitcase with her. And just like today, back then, everyone in old Louisville knew everyone else's business. Before long, people put two and two together. They figured out Miss G was running away. But none of them tried to stop her. And after, a small talk with her friends, she excused herself and she went back to the steps to look for her boyfriend and wait for him. But there was no sign of him, and so she started pacing back and forth where the columns are, waiting. And the evening wore on. There was still no sign of him. It grew colder and darker. There was still no sign of him. Eventually, all the other couples up there drifted away, and in the wee hours of the morning, it was just Miss G up there pacing back and forth in the chill night air. Well, right before daybreak, some late-night partygoers were returning, and they were passing on the sidewalk in front of the church, and one of them knew her. He looked up and said, "Hey, Miss G, why are you out so late? What's going on?" And she said to her friend, "Oh, I'm waiting for someone," and her friend offered to wait with her, but she felt kind of bad. She said, "No, he's got to be here any minute." She said, "Don't worry about it." And her friend said, "Okay, well, we'll see you later," and they proceeded down 3rd Street, heading back into the downtown area. But halfway down the next block, which would have been right in front of my old house, the Whitmer house, her friend decided he didn't want to leave her there on the steps all by herself, especially since it was so cold out. So he said goodbye to his other friends, and he rushed back to wait with Miss G on the steps of the church. But when he arrived, he was surprised to see that the steps were empty. He figured in the several minutes that had transpired, the boyfriend must have shown up and had spirited Miss G away, and they were on their way to Chicago to get married. But by the end of the day, darkness fell, and there Miss G was again on the steps, pacing back and forth and waiting. This time, though, people said she looked a little different. She was sickly, she was pale. When people tried to talk to her, they said they got no response. It was like she couldn't see them, she couldn't hear them. She just paced back and forth like she was in a trance. And the same thing happened all night long. She was there, pacing back and forth, eventually all by herself. And when sun rose the next morning, she was gone. And throughout the next day, there was no sign of her. But sure enough, the 3rd night, darkness fell, and there Miss G was again, pacing back and forth across the steps of the old First Church of Christ Scientist, kind of in a trance-like demeanor, looking sickly and pale. And this time people said you could hear her sobs echo down 3rd Street. And the word quickly spread through the neighborhood. People began asking, what's going on with Miss G? Well, they found out the next morning when the Monday paper came out, and they were able to read about what happened at Camp Zachary Taylor that weekend. So by this point, this would have been early 1919. And if you know anything about the Spanish flu, and everyone's talking about it now, given our current situation, but the Spanish flu kind of came in 3 waves, and the second wave was the worst wave, and that came in early 1919. So the night that they were supposed to elope, young Miss G's boyfriend was one of the soldiers that was struck with the flu at Camp Zachary Taylor. And they were all quarantined. They weren't allowed to leave the base. But as he lay on his cot, he knew his girlfriend was out there waiting for him that night. So the young soldier, he packed a bag. He tried to sneak out through a window and go to her, but they caught him, and they took him back to his bed. They laid him down, but the young soldier kept getting up, trying to sneak out through the window with his luggage. And eventually, they grew tired of trying to catch him and take him back. They eventually just tied him to his cot. And he tried to explain to them, his girlfriend was out there waiting for him. Someone had to go to her. It was a cold night. But he was delirious. He was incoherent. And no one knew what he was talking about. They figured it out after the fact. But the sad thing is, the word never made it back to Miss G. So all night long, for hours, she paced back and forth in the chill night air. And she did eventually give up and go home, but she went home at daybreak. And she went home devastated. She thought she'd been abandoned. And the sad thing is, she went home heartbroken, thought she'd been abandoned. But the really sad thing is, she went home and she contracted the flu as well. The saddest part of all is, 2 days later, both Miss G and her boyfriend were dead, and they went to their graves never ever knowing what happened to the other. So they say the ghost of Miss G is still there today, pacing back and forth, waiting for her soldier boyfriend to show up and take her away to Chicago. And until he does, we've got her in old Louisville. She's one of the most tragic, one of the most romantic stories we have there, and definitely one of the saddest stories. And incidentally, the First Church of Christ Scientist and the Pink Palace, when I do my nightly tours at 7:30, March 15th and November 15th, those are the two places where if people take pictures and something strange is going to show up, it's always at the First Church of Christ Scientist or the Pink Palace. So when things kind of calm down and you're able to come on a tour with me, make sure you take pictures there. And if you find anything strange, make sure you share it on our Facebook page, Louisville Historic Tours, which my friend Sean Stafford is redoing, and Huntley Media is doing a great job. And you come on a tour and you'll be able to see this place up close and personal. So those were our two stories tonight. And what I'm thinking, tomorrow night, I'm going to stay on 3rd Street. 3rd Street, the old Millionaires Row, has tons of haunted houses. And so tomorrow night, I'm going to tell the story of Queen Lucinda. Did you know there was a Queen Lucinda in Louisville back in the day? Well, there was. Her ghost supposedly is seen roaming up and down 3rd Street. There's also a house right near the First Church of Christ Scientist, which has the ghost of an old lady in a rocking chair that's seen on the front porch. So I'll tell you about the ghost of the old lady in the rocking chair. And then the Campion house, which is 2 doors down from where I used to live in the Widmer house, is one of the creepiest stories I uncovered. There's the ghost of 2 little girls who are said to haunt this mansion. So I'll tell you what I found out about these 2 little girls. And then a night or two afterwards, I'll probably be able to scrape up another couple stories, but I'm thinking maybe about Monday night. That's when we'll do our grand finale, and I'll tell you the story of the house in Old Louisville. And that's the topic of my current book project. 1435 South 4th Street was a site of an infamous murder. It made the news the morning of June 18th, 2010, after police were called to the location the night before. They came to break up a domestic dispute, and they ended up leaving with a body in a Tupperware container in the basement that had been buried in the old wine cellar. So it's got everything you can imagine. It's got drag queens, it's got counterfeit money, it's got kinky sex, it's got an old asylum, a haunted house, you got a sledgehammer. Oh, you got so many things in this story, you won't believe it. So we will go out with a bang. I'll tell you that as the last of my ghost stories in the neighborhood. And then after that, like I said, I'll start reading nightly excerpts of my memoir, Voodoo Days at La Casa Fabulosa, which is about my year in the supposedly haunted house that is known as the Widmer House or the Casa Fabulosa today. And it talks about how I lived there and restored the place. It was in good shape, but I had to do a little restoration work. People I met in the neighborhood and the weird experiences I had living in the house. And that's when the Thursday night slash Monday night slash Tuesday night dinner club would meet almost every week at our house. I loved to cook. I was working on my first cookbook. They got to experience some of these strange things. They know a lot of the people I write about in these books, so I have people who can verify a lot of these stories and corroborate them. But like I said before, what was interesting, I moved into what was supposedly a haunted house, and what I discovered, it was the real life characters in the neighborhood who were the most interesting part. So we'll find out a little more about the neighborhood history and find out how I found out about the witch's tree and the voodoo people in Louisville and the gypsies who are in Louisville. Such a great city, and we've got such a wealth of hidden history, and that's the point of a lot of the books I write about Louisville and old Louisville, is letting people know what a great neighborhood it is, the great architecture we have, the great characters, and then just the great people. Louisville is a great city. So if you've never been to Louisville, you got to come and see us. Louisvillians are very friendly. Like I said, I was only going to stay here for 1 year, but they won me over, and now I'm an honorary Louisvillian. So I'm glad you turned out tonight for our 7th night, and look forward to seeing you tomorrow night with your bourbon. Spread the news and bring people along. If we can get a little more people every night, that's great. It's great for the city to promote these stories and promote our great architecture. They're saying, Louisville is going to be the new Savannah, the new Charleston in the next 5-10 years. More and more people are coming. They're discovering our great architecture, our great history, our friendly people. And, this is the place where the tobacco titans live, the bourbon barons, the racetrack royalty. Like I said before, drinking, smoking, and gambling, all those people are what made Louisville. So it's not surprising it's a city that knows how to have fun. So unfortunately, we're not going to be able to do the Kentucky Derby this year in May, but it'll be coming back in September, hopefully. So if you don't have your plans yet, if you've never been here, come and see us for a September Kentucky Derby. It'll be a great way to explore the city, and we'll be doing our tours then, hopefully. So would love to see you. And goodness, I've got sirens and lights on outside. So something's going on in the neighborhood. Can you see that? So I'm going to go out and see what's going on. I hope it's not the neighbor's house. But lights are on in the Magic Library, so I'll turn them back on tomorrow night. So thanks again for coming, everyone. Love you all. Stay safe. Stay in good spirits. And like I said, you're really helping me get through this by checking in every night. So 9 o'clock tomorrow night. Look forward to seeing you. Take care. Bye-bye.